Okay. Welcome everybody. Welcome one and all. It is great to have everybody back here. I hope you are doing well. I hope everyone is well. It's great to see everybody. I want to thank everybody also for doing, those of you who did the challenge. The challenge number 2 was a huge success, and many of you are amazing poets writing your own prophecies. So thank you so much. I really appreciated that. Last week we talked about the Matthean Wave, okay? And we looked at why scholars dated any time really between 42 and 150, and how that makes sense, how you could do that based on the wave model. And we talked about initial forms and final forms and so on and so forth. Now, everybody who's anybody, I think, agrees that Matthew and Mark are related. And about 98% of scholars, maybe even 99, maybe 99.9% of scholars today believe that Matthew used Mark. I know there are a few voices crying out in the wilderness that Matthew was first. Fun fact, actually, that's pretty much what everyone in the early church thought, that Matthew was first. That's pretty amazing that they went that route. And that's important for us to know in terms of the history of reception. I mean, we've really gone about face, like modern scholarship says, pretty much, definitely, Mark is first. This is considered one of the assured results of modern scholarship, one of the huge turning points that we owe to 19th century scholars, most of them working in Germany. So what else can we learn, though, about what I'll call the Matthean Wave? Well, I'll just share my screen here. All right, so let's talk about the Matthean Wave, and let's talk about how one might date the Matthean Wave, okay? There is internal attestation, and I'm going to start there, okay? And I'm going to start at my favorite little place, it is the Little Apocalypse, the Little Apocalypse. The Little Apocalypse has a big effect when it comes to dating. And we looked at the Little Apocalypse in Mark 13. But Matthew, or I should say the Matthean Wave, basically lengthens this apocalypse, refines it, and I mean 95% of it just takes over. And then this is a characteristic of the Matthean Wave, that actually 90% of Mark, roughly 90% of the Markan wave, let's say, is preserved in the Matthean Wave. So there's actually, we're in the case sort of that, we might not even call these two documents separate names, because honestly, we could just call them, Mark 1 and Mark 2. I mean, because literally, like, if you've got 90% of a book that's preserved in, this so-called other book, is it really a different book? Most people assume it's a different book, but is it really a different book, or is it just a revision of the same book? Are we looking at the wave theory, right in front of us, under our noses, so to speak, without even realizing it, right? So there are changes, however, and looking at the changes in the Matthean Wave is what's called redaction criticism. That is, we're looking at the kinds of editorial decisions, and many of these are very small, the kind of decisions that a scribe would make. And one of them is in 24.3, where the author seems less focused on the temple's destruction than on the sign for the coming of the end of the age. And he introduces this word parousia. For some reason, it's cut off here. That's the P. He introduces this word parousia because, and that is the advent. It's really the advent of an emperor or king, but it is the advent specifically of the emperor or king Jesus from the sky. Okay, so that is interesting, that he doesn't want to talk, and you can open up, Matthew chapter 24 and look along with me. I can't fit the entire text here on the screen. That would overwhelm people. But basically, if you look at Matthew 24, and if you compare that with the opening of the little apocalypse in the Matthean Wave, he has adjusted things so that it's not just about the temple's destruction, it's about the sign for the end of the age and the advent, or parousia in Greek, of the King Messiah from the sky. Okay, so he's shifting the focus a little bit, and that's the first thing to notice. Okay, now the other thing that I want to say, and I just want to say up front here, because in some ways this is just laying down my cards, but despite the fact that most scholars go for the middle dating of the Matthean Wave, I'm actually quite convinced, and I hope to convince you. If not, we got plenty of time to talk about it. But I hope to convince you that the middle dating, that is a date range between about 75 and 90, actually doesn't work at all for the Matthean Wave. And I'm going to tell you why. It has to do with another change that the Matthean author makes to the little apocalypse. Okay, so in the little apocalypse, this is Matthew 24:29, the Matthean author does something very strange. Normally, when he sees Mark use this word immediately, which is euthus or eutheos in Greek, he removes almost every instance. But in this case, very significantly, a very significant editorial decision he makes is he actually puts in immediately rather than taking it out. So he's looking at, whatever to him was the Matthean Wave, and there's no immediately, but he adds immediately, so that in this particular version of the prophecy, after the prophesied tribulation or distress, Jesus, or the Son of Man, comes immediately out of the clouds and gathers the elect. Okay, that's not in the Matthean Wave, but that is in the Matthean Wave. And I think this is fascinating because it shows, I won't say beyond a doubt, but it shows very, very powerfully, I think, that the authors or editors of Matthew expected that after the tribulation, okay, you would have an immediate appearance of Jesus from the sky. Now, if the author of Matthew is writing in the wake of 70, usually people put him 10 years after Mark. So if Mark is writing in 70, then Matthew must be about 80. But if Matthew, and I'm just using Matthew as a cipher here, if the Matthean author is writing about 80, okay, he knows that Jesus didn't come immediately. So there would be no reason, absolutely no reason, for him to add immediately if he thought that the prophesied distress referred to the temple. Okay, now this point is so important, and I'm happy to repeat it because it's so very important for the dating game. It shows us that this author is not probably referring to the destruction of the temple. If he's writing, 10 years after the event, he knows that after the destruction of the temple, Jesus didn't come. So he's not going to put in an immediately. Okay, so then we have basically two options. Either we can go the conservative evangelical route and date Matthew prior to 70, prior to the destruction of the temple, and then just say that, he was wrong. When the temple was destroyed, Jesus didn't come. Okay, sad but true. Okay, there you go. Or we can say that we are at some point far beyond 70, and the Matthean author or authors is looking towards some other distressful event, not the destruction of the temple, but some other distress, some other tribulation. Much like the author of the book of Revelation. You know, most people think that the book of Revelation is written after 70, but this author still has in mind a future tribulation and distress. So, you know, and that's when Jesus comes, right? So in this reading, Matthew, whoever that is, the Matthean Wave, this rolling corpus of editors, is looking forward to a future tribulation. They know that the temple is destroyed. They know that Jesus didn't come, but they still think that there is a future distress. Okay. And that's when Jesus is going to come. All right. So those are kind of our two options. All right. Now, why not before 70? This is an important question. Why do only very conservative evangelical scholars even say that it was before 70? And why is that actually implausible? Well, here's a few things to keep in mind. Okay, we've got this parable in the Matthean Wave 22:7. It's the parable of these, you know, very bad dudes, and the king sends his troops at the end of the parable to kill these killers, essentially, and to set their city on fire. Now, what's interesting about this is another one of those redactional changes that is only in the Matthean Wave and in nowhere else. Okay, so if we're thinking about a city that was set on fire and that was destroyed and that murderers were killed, many people, this is not some kind of like smoking gun, but many people can't help but think of the events of, you know, the crucifixion of Jesus and the Christian ideology that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was a kind of God's payback for killing the Son of God. Okay, it's a sick kind of thing. I'm not, but it is what Christians said all the time in antiquity. Okay, that God paid these murderers back. Okay, so that could be what's being said here. Again, this is not a smoking gun, but why else would you add this particular detail unless you knew that Jerusalem would be burned and destroyed? Okay, the other indication of a later time for the Matthean Wave is the author is kind of obsessed about people not being called rabbi. Okay, he's in Matthew 23:7-8, he insists, unlike the other Gospels, he insists that nobody gets to be called rabbi. Nobody gets to be called rabbi. And although this title is attested here and there for an earlier period, it becomes something of an official title for a Jewish sage only in the late 1st century. And so one can see that what seems to be happening here is that the author or authors or editors of the Matthean Wave are responding to a cultural trend in their time, late 1st century, where you're beginning to have the beginnings of what we call the rabbinic movement. And, you know, this rabbinic movement will give birth to actual rabbis. And some of them are named in rabbinic sources. If you know anything about the Mishnah and the Talmuds, you know, they know rabbis from the late 1st century and certainly the early 2nd century, Rabbi Akiva being a very big name here. But there's also many others. So the fact that this author distinctively doesn't want anyone being called rabbi indicates that he's concerned or about this particular time in both Jewish and Christian history, which would be in the late 1st century when we get the birth of the rabbinic movement. Okay, again, not a smoking gun, but something to consider. Okay. Now, the other key factor here is we get what I think is an utterly weird thing. right at the end of the Matthean Wave. And the utterly weird thing at the end of the Matthean Wave is you've got a Trinitarian, full-blown Trinitarian baptismal formula. Okay. It appears nowhere else in any of the other 27 documents that, or 26 documents that made it into the New Testament, as it was known in the 4th century. This is the only one. It's, baptize them in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, in the name of the Holy Spirit. This sounds like it's a very advanced formula. Nobody else is pairing, well, not pairing, but, sort of, bringing all 3 figures together, okay? All 3 figures, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all in one, all one package. Now, of course, I'm aware that evangelical and conservative scholars want to find the Trinity everywhere in the New Testament, and you can, Google the Trinity in the New Testament, and you'll get every pastor, between Connecticut and California on their blog is going to tell you that the Trinity is in the New Testament, but it's just not the case. It's just not the case, folks. I mean, read it through yourself and tell me. I mean, I have not found the Trinity in the New Testament except here in this Trinitarian baptismal formula. Okay. Obviously, in the documents that made it into the New Testament, you have mention of a Father, you have mention of a Son, and you occasionally have mention of a Spirit or a Holy Spirit, but they don't appear together as 3 separate persons working in unison to purify the baptized person. Okay. This is it. This is only in the Matthean Wave. I mean, even the other Gospels don't even bother with this particular formula. And, frankly, the New Testament, and a very late document in the New Testament, which we will also discuss, the book of Acts, talks all about baptism and completely ignores this formula and insists that the formula is actually baptism into the name of Jesus, which is fascinating because is this some kind of disagreement? I mean, apparently, because one text is insisting that the baptism be in the Trinitarian formula, and historically we know that this particular formula won out, but there are other formulas that still exist in the New Testament and they didn't win out. Okay, so this sounds like 2nd century, all right? This is a case where if it smells, smells like a duck and walks like a duck, it probably is a duck. I mean, no one spoke like this in the 1st century, documentedly. Like, there's no other documented case of people using the 3 Trinitarian persons in this particular neat packaged way. Okay. All right. Now, again, no smoking gun, right? Because this could be a later edition, right? A very later edition. We believe in the wave model. This could have been added in the very final draft. Maybe. I mean, we have to think about that. But in its current form, it's very unlikely that the Matthean Wave would be prior to 70, and those are the reasons why. Let's look briefly at external attestation, okay? We have this text from Eusebius, whom we met last week. Eusebius is an early 4th century church historian. He writes his church history. In fact, that itself is a rolling corpus because he puts out at least 3 editions between about the year 307 and the year 325. And the first 7 books end up in the 1st edition, and this is where he quotes this guy named Papias. And in Eusebius's day, he had a copy of Papias's documents, but we don't have them anymore. So we are depending solely on Eusebius, whom we know is a very, can be a somewhat devious quoter of texts. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But according to Papias, through Eusebius, we have a reference to a Matthew who compiled the oracles, in the Greek the logia, or the sayings, in the Hebrew language. Okay, that's all he says. That's all he says. All right. Would this refer to our Matthean Wave? Would this refer to a narrative? Evidently not, because logia are sayings, not stories. And do we think that the Matthean Wave started out as a Hebrew text? Nobody thinks that today. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. I mean, there are going to be always exceptions, but 99% of New Testament scholars believe that the Matthean Wave is based on the Markan Wave. It's a revision of the Markan Wave. And so there's no reason to imagine that there was a Hebrew original. And there's no reason to imagine that he was translating from Hebrew, because there isn't these Semitisms, that it isn't translation Greek, right? You can sometimes tell when something is a translation and when it's not a translation. Okay. So this is the background. But actually, the main question here really is, who the heck is Matthew, right? I mean, this guy Papias, who is supposedly in the early 2nd century, mentions a Matthew, but it's not like the author of the Matthean Wave, or the editors, it's not like they ever identify with somebody named Matthew. I wish people would shout this from the rooftops, because everyone is in such a habit, including myself, this is a habit I myself am trying to break. Everyone is calling this gospel Matthew, when, as I never tire of pointing out, he never calls himself Matthew, and Luke never calls himself Luke, and John never calls himself John, and Mark never calls himself Mark. I mean, this is the crazy thing, like, of how tradition has captured our minds and has shaped how we read the text, but the texts don't even have names, right? So this is the obvious question to ask any person in antiquity. We can ask it to Papias. We can ask it to modern conservatives and evangelicals. Who the heck is Matthew? The only thing that we have in this Matthean Wave is a story where a tax collector named Levi in the Markan Wave, and as we'll see in the Lucan Wave, is renamed Matthew. That's it. That's it. That's like the one tiny toehold out of this tiny, tiny grain of sand. People make a mountain as big as Everest. Okay. This author, by changing the name of this tax collector to Matthew, becomes Matthew. If any of you try to, run that through a normal, logical, mathematical, scientific process and weigh the logic of that, I guarantee you this will always fall short. This is simply a wild guess, based on nothing, If the author wanted us to know that his name was Matthew, he would have said so, because, as I never tire of repeating, if this is an apostle named Matthew, that's the very first thing he would have told you, right? To gain authority for his book, but he never does. Okay. The last part of this, before we get to questions, is the Didache. And we talked a bit about the Didache last week. The Didache is a church order. It is apparently our first church order. And by me, if any of you know the genre of, like, some of these Roman Catholic missals, or certain churches, certain denominations will publish, their liturgies, if they're more of a high church variety, and they'll publish like guidelines, like the Methodist Book of Discipline is a great example. That's a church order. So the Didache is its own church order, and you can go read this. You can find it online, but there are many, many translations of this. And it was a document that we found in this 11th century, this medieval manuscript in the late 19th century. So we didn't know about it prior to that. So it was a great find. And we find in this particular book, which seems to be very early, we find references, and I've given you the references here, to the gospel, or his gospel. So we have reference to, praying as the Lord commanded in his gospel, and advice about apostles and prophets to, that they are supposed to act according to the teaching of the gospel, and that people are to perform their vows and their charity and every deed as they have it in the gospel. And the obvious question is, okay, which one is that, right? If any, do we recognize anything in terms of our gospels? Because we know that there are many. The very fact that this author is referring only to one implies one of two things. Either he only knew one, or he only knew one written gospel, or he knows of many gospels, but he chooses, like Marcion, to believe that there's only one. Okay, those are our two options. Well, if we analyze the things that he says about the gospel, particularly in what is now called the Lord's Prayer, it does sound most like the Matthean Wave. Okay, and everybody agrees about that. Okay, but what's interesting about this is, even when we look at the Lord's Prayer in the Didache and the Lord's Prayer in the Matthean Wave, and this is in Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, there are differences. Not huge, but substantial. I mean, it's not like they're exactly the same prayer that one exactly copied over. And so we can imagine a situation where the prayer is either known or memorized orally, or it's from some other source. Okay, so that's what's going on in the background. Unfortunately, besides this Lord's Prayer bit, when the author of the Didache refers to the gospel, he doesn't provide, or she doesn't provide, any direct quotes. So we can't pinpoint what is really being referred to. Okay. The big problem, though, here is that the date range, it's not like the Didache could solve the dating problem, because the date range of the Didache is itself a problem. We don't know what its date is, and there have been guesses anywhere between 70 and 150. Well, that's pretty much the date range of Matthew. So, I mean, it's not like, this document is going to help us date Matthew. They are, probably they are surely at the same time. And we don't know who is taking from who. Maybe both are taking from both. Maybe they are both waves, that is, texts which are accreting traditions over time, and they are borrowing from each other on multiple occasions. And so, they are essentially simultaneous. They're simultaneous causations. All right, so we're at the end here. We'll get right into questions. As you probably all know, there's a gazillion things written on Matthew, and the great unfortunate thing that happens is that when you have a commentary, 95% of all commentaries on biblical texts are written by conservative evangelicals. Okay, 95%. Why is that? Because it's sort of like a genre that they've claimed, right? And all of these people, they kind of say the same things. They have the same arguments about dating. They all want to say Matthew is somehow apostolic, and these arguments just keep getting repeated and repeated and repeated. So when I have a commentary, or when I find a commentary that is out of the evangelical conservative mold, this is the one that I recommend. And so if any of you know Dale Allison, he's now at Princeton. He's a great guy. And actually, I know from him, he told me this personally, that it's co-authored, but actually Allison wrote this pretty much by himself. So it's called A Critical and Exegetical Commentary on the Gospel According to Matthew. This is part of a series, which is a pretty good series. It's called the ICC series, the International Critical Commentary. And Dale also has, this is 3 volumes. Dale also has a 1-volume edition, which is just an abbreviation. And then if you're interested in learning more about the Didache, there's a huge amount of resources there. A bunch of stuff by a guy named Clayton Jefford is good. But most recently, Sean Wilhite's got a intro and commentary on the Didache. And although, it's fairly conservative in orientation, it's pretty reliable in terms of what it has to say. Again, I mean, if you want to, if you want me to tell you, what's good and what's not good in terms of the scholarly world, I'm happy to go into that further. but these are resources that I would recommend.